Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Molly White. I'm from the Office of Social Emotional Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education, and I'm so excited to be joined here today by Dr. Krista Goldstein Cole. She has been a pioneer in ACE education. Oops, sorry, the video always overplays on itself as we stream. But she has been a pioneer in ACE work, and she is here today to talk about high tech, low touch, a conversation on deep challenges of school engagement in COVID times. She has also served as a policy advisor on human services and corrections in the Washington State Senate Democratic Caucus. She has earned her doctorate in human development at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And we're just so glad and happy to be having you here sharing your wonderful wisdom with us. So with that, I will pass the mic over to you, Krista.
Great, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and to again have the opportunity to talk with educators from New Hampshire. From everything I've seen and heard, it is a terrific place to be if you're a student, and it looks like it might also be a wonderful place to be if you are a teacher as well. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty, which I think is good because part of what I'm going to talk about today is some of our beliefs about how good we are at technology. Molly, can you help me out? I need to stop sharing and reset this PowerPoint.
So you're no longer sharing with us.
Oh, okay. So let me figure this out. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is how much we assume that the young people that we're teaching know about technology and how connected they are to digital technology. As part of our ways of thinking about doing virtual schooling and how that may be affecting school engagement over time. So it's perfectly apropos that I would start with some technical difficulties, I think. Okay, I think we've got it. Can you see that, Molly?
Absolutely, that is perfect now.
Great. So I've heard, talking with the Department of Education, I think just as a practical matter, I've heard that it is challenging in a lot of classrooms to have engagement of students, whether that's in a hybrid setting or whether it's in a virtual setting where kids are either not showing up at all, they're not showing up consistently, or they're showing up but they're really not doing their work, and there's this lack of engagement. And I know that it's frustrating, and that there are really limited options for teachers, especially when the only options that are available are to be making referrals to the justice system due to truancy. So the first thing I want to let you know is that you're absolutely not alone if you're struggling with engagement in your classrooms. There's a brand new report. It came out just a few days ago from Bellwether Education, where they found that approximately 3 million students are currently out of school and disengaged as a result of the way that COVID education is currently occurring. That same study suggests that there are about 36,000 New Hampshire students that are likely missing from school at this time. And the biggest risk factors for those students are that they're in foster care, that they're homeless, or that they're experiencing some kind of violence in the home, that they're English language learners, or that they're special education students. So those are the 5 categories of students who are most likely to be completely missing from school at this time. So what I'd like to do today is to start by just acknowledging that students have extremely vast responsibility for the healthy development of children and their success as adults. I mean, we ask students, and especially we ask teachers, to ensure learning the way that we measure it on current accountability tools, that we provide the co-regulation that students need in order to adapt to school in a social emotional kind of way, and that we also ask students to foster belonging and attachment to school so that they continue to participate. And we do all of that so that students graduate from high school on time with the knowledge, skills, and pro-social orientation needed for their civic and economic participation throughout their lifespan. And that is a really big mission, right? It is an incredible ask of educators. And then we now layer over that a pandemic, as you all well know. And what we get is what is called a wicked mess in systems thinking. Wicked with that sort of Boston tradition of how you speak, not like immoral mess, right? It's a big, big, murky mess that is really characterized by having incomplete, contradictory, or changing requirements. Surely that has been happening for the past year, right? That it has resistance to problem solving, and we could spend a whole hour just talking about the ways that resistance come up. It doesn't appear to be something we can fix with a single solution. There's no stopping point. It's not like there's not a moment where when we make this decision, everything's fine, right? It's always kind of ongoing mess and murk. And the solutions are not true and false. There's not one right solution out there. They're better and worse. And one of the things I really admire about New Hampshire is the sort of flexibility you have at the local level to try and figure out what's better and worse in the particular context that you're in. And specifically, a wicked mess has variety in the causes and effects, right? There's differences in cause and effect, and there are delays between the cause and the effect, and that there's social complexity attached to it. So what we're going to do in this workshop is the goal is just to fuel discussion. And the reason for that is that when you have a wicked mess, what systems thinking teaches us is that when you have a wicked mess, there's not one right answer. And that means the way that you get to solutions has to be dialogue. You have to be able to talk with each other and have open discussions that are framed in a helpful and productive way. So the goal here is to really try to fuel discussion at the local level and to make sure that you have what you need to engage in conversations about how to address student engagement. So I'll really be thinking in terms of three questions as we move forward. What does it mean to be a student and to participate in school? The student perspective may be very different from our ideas about, our adult ideas about truancy and attendance, right? How do we manage and respond to student non-participation? As adults, when we look at kids not engaging in school, what do we do about it? Do we report them to the courts for truancy? Do we report them to Child Protective Services for educational neglect? How do we respond to non-participation? And what might we try next? And so that's what I'll be thinking about and asking you to engage with. And we'll have these particular objectives. Given our time together, you should be able to reflect on and discuss with colleagues the ways in which distance and hybrid learning challenge students' identification with school. And as you'll see, the potential that identifying with school is critical to engagement. We'll see how that works. Also being able to identify potential barriers to student engagement within your local context. And finally, being prepared to work at the local level to develop options to address student engagement and non-participation beyond just referring kids for truancy from school. So we're going to start here with belonging, connection, and identification. Then we'll go on to the negative consequences of non-identification with school, followed by core assumptions about students in this age of COVID, focusing on how some of those assumptions are false and contradict identification needs of students. And finally, we will examine how to frame these issues and seek solutions within a local discussion. So belonging and connectedness is actually a core human need, right? All the way back to Aristotle. folks have observed that humans are social animals, and every bit of science that we have since Aristotle tells us that belonging with other human beings is critical to our mental health, it's critical to our behavioral health, and our ability to function in the world. Baumeister and Leary actually argue that if we lack belonging, like if we're not able to achieve belonging in our world, we actually become psychotic. So the current talk in social media, on the news and in our private lives about mental health is no joke, right? As people lose their connection and their sense of belonging with others and experience social isolation of lockdown and virtual schooling, mental health really is at stake, because not belonging is associated with many poor academic and behavioral difficulties in addition to mental health. And those are both within the school context, within substance abuse, and within juvenile delinquency outside of school. Uh, Belonging is actually more than our state of being right now, though. It's part of a developmental process that starts with bonding in the first few years of life. And that is how we build a trusting relationship with our parents and the people in our caretaking circle when we're quite small. And what that does is it builds a blueprint for relationships. We come out of that early time with caregivers with a sense of what is a relationship and how do we behave and regulate ourselves inside of that relationship. And we take that blueprint with us into new environments like school. And it becomes our source of regulatory processes like self-soothing, impulse control, inhibitory control, and executive function. And it also helps us be able to attach to institutional settings like school. So social control theory tells us that what happens at school is we get attached to school because it co-regulates through telling us what social norms are. Social development theory says that the system of rewards for attachment helps us to become more consistently pro-social in an environment like school. And resilience theory tells us that we adapt and build confidence so that school becomes a safe haven for us as children. And so this is how belonging sort of develops from being at home in the early years to being in school. And developmental belonging and develop, that's what's called cascading. And cascading is actually an idea in psychology that comes from rivers. So if you look out at a river, you see that the water moves through, but it doesn't all move at the same pace, right? Some of the water goes over a rock and it gets redirected away from the stream or to a new place, or it moves at a different speed. And that's where the idea of cascading development comes from. And basically it means that what happens upstream helps to determine what happens downstream. That's one part of cascading. But the other part of cascading is that if something goes wrong in one dimension, it carries over into another dimension. So if a child is having difficulty with belonging and attachment at home, that also comes into the school domain through social emotional regulation, through executive function, through how the child views authority. So that's what cascading means. And we know from the cascading literature that connectedness is actually a prerequisite to learning. So that if children don't feel connected, then learning becomes a much lower priority for them, right? We know that school connectedness is associated with academic performance and persistence, that teacher support and help is associated with increases in engagement over time, and that the absence of belonging at school is associated with many poor outcomes, including truancy, disruptive behavior when a child is in school, poor academic performance, juvenile delinquency, and ultimately dropping out of school. So you can have positive or negative cascades. And so when those belonging pieces are missing, it becomes very important to kids' ability to stay in school and to show up at school. So in a situation where we're really concerned about engagement and kids showing up, we need to ask some important questions about how are we managing the issue of belonging. So beyond belonging is this idea of school identification. And this comes from Jeremy Finn, who did extraordinary work in the late 1980s, sort of consolidating the literature about school dropout and school persistence, as well as juvenile delinquency. And he came to this idea that there are really two models for understanding student persistence. One is what he calls the identification participation model. So students identify with school and so they persist in school. And then the second is called the frustration self-esteem model. And in that case, kids become so frustrated that their self-esteem doesn't include participation in school and that they're at serious risk for dropout. So this idea of identification is that students have an internalized sense of belonging at school, something they carry with them as part of their identity. And they are discernibly part of the school environment, right? So that means that school constitutes an important part of their experience. They prioritize schoolwork, they participate in school activities, their social circle includes friends from school and peer groups. Um, it constitutes identification with school, constitutes an important part of their daily experience, and they value success at school and school related goals, school relevant goals. And for some students, those may be more extracurricular than they are academic. For example, we may have some students whose academic or whose athletic participation is how they identify with school, and they do their homework and they participate in class because they want to be able to play basketball or football or be in the band, that sort of thing. Identification is an internal state or emotional dimension that is separate from behavior. And that means young people have to feel like they identify with school. That is the identification part. Participation or non-participation is not the identification part. It is the consequence of how, this behavioral consequence of the emotion. And finally, participation in school, including extracurricular activities and governance experiences, help to foster identification with school. So we're going to move from there to talking about what happens when identification fails. If kids are not identifying with school, they haven't developed that sense of internalized identity with school, then what happens? That's when we get this frustration self-esteem model that places kids at high risk of antisocial behaviors and dropping out of school. So students who do not identify with school are frustrated, right? School doesn't have meaning for them. They don't know what they're supposed to do here. It's confusing, etc. And then their self-esteem begins to reflect a sense that they don't belong, that they're rejected, that they're not welcome, that they don't fit, that something's wrong with them, that they're not able to do what their friends are, those kinds of feelings. And this often manifests as resistance, especially resistance to authority, resistance to doing the work, resistance to being present at school. And all of those things fuel a risk of dropping out. For these students, the risk of dropout and push out is very high. And there's also a much higher risk of contact with the justice system, which is its own reinforcing loop that keeps kids out of school. So non-participation takes many forms. It can be truancy or chronic absenteeism, which I understand you're seeing a lot of. It can be difficulty in performing tasks, right? And this is sometimes due to just having missed so much school. I don't know what to do next. I don't know where we are. I missed some building block. It can take the form of poor emotional and behavioral regulation, and students can be very difficult for teachers to manage. Resistance to authority, which also can be very difficult to manage, obviously, and then dropout. And all of these, what Finn tells us is that all of these behavioral forms of non-participation should be viewed as early patterns of withdrawal from school, which is one reason why it's important for us to be thinking about this as the numbers are so high and climbing around non-participation at this time. I just want to take a second to note that the risk factors that are associated with lack of identification are also similar to those of students who have high adversity at home, such as maltreatment. So Blodgett found in 2012 that even among the youngest students in grades 2, 3, and 4, that truancy and excessive or chronic absenteeism is often fueled by chronic health problems, even either in the child or the parent generation, that the children have difficulty performing tasks due to that missed time, as well as developmental issues that are impacted by being high adversity, that these kids have poor emotional and behavioral regulation resulting from developmental adaptations and deficits. There are a lot of referrals to special education, particularly for behavioral and emotional disturbances, and that there's excessive discipline and suspension from school for these kids. So you can see there's a really strong overlap between kids who are high adversity and kids who are disengaged from school due to non-identification with school. So that gives us lots of reasons to really think hard and think critically about how we're doing at promoting identification among our students. So given the issues that we're having with non-participation in the hybrid and the high-tech environment, it's worth asking whether we've assumed some things about how young people identify with technology, right? And whether we have, as adults, beliefs about how students identify with and manage digital technology that's sort of driving how we're structuring virtual and hybrid schools, and whether that may be causing some identification issues. And I think that part of how we've assumed that that high tech, low tech, like we moved forward thinking high tech, low touch was going to work pretty well for students. It might be really hard for educators who aren't that familiar with the technology, but we think of the kids as being digital natives. And one of the reasons we think about them being digital natives is because that is a catchphrase that has been very popular over the last 20 years or so. And I'm going to argue that our systems assume that today's students are digital natives and that they're able to navigate web-based platforms and identify with digital platforms and therefore with online schools. That's like one of the fundamental assumptions we made in structuring our current response to COVID and education. So let's start with this question of who are digital natives. The term was originally coined in 2001 by Mark Prensky to describe children who were born after 1980 and who live in a permanent state of technological immersion and dependence. Tapscott and Williams described digital natives as those born between 1977 and they call the students born between 1977 and 1996 the net generation, which is not only fluent and literate in the web, but hardwired for digital technology. And then Ho argues that growing up in the digital age constitutes a developmental ecology that shapes skills, cascades, and developmental trajectories. So we're making some really big assumptions about how kids relate to the digital environment, given this milieu of how we talk about kids. Like, of course, they're going to be fine. They're going to be great. They're going to do better than teachers in the digital environment, right? They're going to relate to it, and it's going to work fine. It's going to be actually a source of identification for students. Except that it appears that our talk of digital natives is mythology. The first and most important thing to notice here is that there is no empirical data, none, to support this view that young people are hardwired and developed to identify with technology as a primary source of existence. Generation Z is just not comporting to the descriptions of youth that adults are using to describe how they relate to technology. Just empirically is false. So for example, studies show that the prevalence of use for the internet is for games, texting, and content retrieval. Those are all very passive exercises that do not require much critical thinking. And so as a result, critical thinking in the digital era is lacking for these kids, and it's something that has to be taught directly. So leaping to a space, a digital space where education is asking young people to be involved in a digital space at the same time that we're really pushing them in a higher order thinking skills, that's actually a really tough thing for young people that we see as digital natives. And finally, we know from Weinberg's recent work that young people have difficulty distinguishing between credible and misinformation. And this is because they rely heavily on visible cues, such as font and professional looking banners. So, excuse me. So students actually think that if a web page is beautiful, right, and it has pretty logos and it has a strong font, students are much more likely to identify that as a credible and believable website, and they lack the skills to be able to sort of deconstruct what might be true and false in that space. So the evidence that we do have tells us that maybe our assumptions as adults, that how we as adults think about this generation and their relationship to digital technology might need some work, because it's probably false for many of these kids, right? And then as a practical matter, we know that there are a lot of kids who might be very good with technology, but they're not completely immersed in technology as their developmental ecology. And the reason is because their families try to limit screen time, especially for young children. They may have parental controls that keep kids from going to certain areas of the internet or other digital technologies. Many families, especially in rural areas, have limited access to the internet. And finally, kids often have to share devices with their peers or even with their parents. So it's not an immersive environment for them. And I know that New Hampshire, like so many educational jurisdictions, have been struggling with how do we even get technology to a portion of our students. If a portion of our students lack technology, then we certainly should not be viewing them as digital natives, and we shouldn't be viewing them as having an automatic identification with the digital environment because of their status as digital environment or as digital natives, right? So we may, what I'm trying to say is that we may be asking students to achieve their identification with school through digital technology, and we're thinking that that works because we're thinking of them as digital natives. But we have to ask ourselves whether our students are achieving identification with school in this setting, and whether our current experience with students being disengaged and not participating in school, the degree to which that's associated with our assumptions around digital native status. I guess it's digital nativity status. And then we have to ask ourselves whether our current responses to disengagement are appropriate, or whether they're creating irreversible patterns of withdrawal, right? So if we go back to Jeremy Finn, he tells us that when kids aren't identifying with school, when they're having this frustration, self-esteem experience, that is an early pattern of withdrawal. So we really need to be asking ourselves whether what we're seeing now with so many kids being out of school and so many more struggling with being in the digital environment, whether we are creating patterns of withdrawal. Those are important questions for us to be thinking about. So the last thing I'd like to do here is to talk about how to frame these issues as we seek solutions. And I want to really take a systems thinking approach to this. And one reason I want to take a systems thinking approach is because the success of all children, the successful education of all children in the in this COVID hybrid digital education environment is a wicked mess, right? And a wicked complex problem that doesn't seem to have any answers always indicates that we need to take a systems approach. It is never about singular individuals. It's never about the classroom teacher. It's never about the individual students. It's the systems issue. But I do this for a second reason as well. And that is because whenever we see shaming and blaming, we know that it is a systems problem. So the way that shaming and blaming emerge is that we see observed behaviors, right? And we infer that that those behaviors that we see represent the system as a whole, right? So we might see a teacher having a bad day and not connecting as well with students as she might on some other day, and we infer that that as a result, that's how the whole system works, and teachers are bad. And once I say, shaming, blaming, as when we hear sentences start with those teachers, or if only the teachers' unions would, or only the teachers' unions wouldn't, or some of those teachers are great, but most of them are not. We hear words like lazy, incompetent, inflexible, old, any of those things, and I'm sure you've heard some of them. Those are all shaming and blaming behaviors, right? And the single best indicator that we need a systems approach to a problem is when we hear shaming and blaming. And a systems approach is going to be where we really examine our mental models. So let me show you what I mean here. A system is like an iceberg, and you all know that 90% of an iceberg is under the water where you can't see it. And so what we can see are observed behaviors, right? What individual people do in individual situations. And if we're very lucky, we might be able to see patterns of behaviors. But sometimes patterns or behaviors are below the water. If we're just taking this is an easy problem kind of approach, we focus on those observed behaviors, what teachers are doing, what students are doing. We notice a pattern that lots of students don't have internet access, so we push internet access out so that kids can engage, right? Those are those top level problems. But underneath, what's really driving the systems all the way down at the bottom of the iceberg are principles. And principles are things like fairness, equity, access, those kinds of things. And then we build what are called mental models from those principles. So fairness can take lots of forms, right? Fairness can take the form that everybody is treated exactly the same. That could be fair. But fairness could also be viewed as everybody gets what they need. And that's a different form of fairness, right? Or we could say that fairness is that everyone has an opportunity to engage in the process. And so that's fair, right? So everybody has the chance to go to school. And if they work hard there, then they'll get great outcomes, right? So that's also another form of fairness. So we have different views of what it means to be fair. And out of those views, we build structures. And structures are things like methods, rules, laws, those kinds of things. So if we just take a concrete example of this, we could say that we really want access to school for everyone. And we draw on those mental models of digital natives. Okay, this is a generation of kids who know the internet, and they're going to be great at the internet because they're digital natives. That's our mental model. And so we build structures like online and virtual learning, and we create structures around that. When kids will be in school, how long they'll be on Zoom, what kind of homework they'll be doing given online instruction. Those are the structures that we build. And then we observe patterns of behaviors, like some kids are really disengaged. So that is how the systems thinking iceberg works when we're trying to solve difficult problems. So when we take this home, when we think about having about how do you frame a dialogue that's a system in a systems thinking kind of way that takes on these tough problems and this wicked mess of non-participation and non-identification with school. Here are some take-home questions, right? So at the principal's level, down at the bottom of the iceberg, which is where we start to build common ground and really get important change, because you get better change the farther down you are in the iceberg. So the first question is, how do we understand identification with and participation in school in these COVID times? Like what are we really thinking about in terms of our principles for education at the time? Is this understanding of what it means to identify and participate in school aligned with what we know about about the students we're trying to reach? That becomes our mental models question. Then we think about what potential barriers to student engagement occur in our local context, because it's going to be a lot different. I just recently moved to rural Colorado from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my life is very different. Like I don't have cell phone at home, and I have very slow internet that I get from satellite, right? And only one person in the house can use the internet at one time because of how limited it is, right? And that is really very different than the folks who live in Denver, right? I live in a rural part of Colorado. Folks in Denver have a completely different experience, right? And I'm sure that that must also be the case in Massachusetts. Like I'm sure that Manchester has a very different kind of infrastructure than some of those rural places up north, right? And then how might we work in collaboration to reduce those barriers? Because a wicked problem can never be solved alone. It always has to be about collaboration, right? And then to what degree are we satisfied with student engagement at this time? So that's the pattern of behavior. We've taken these principles, we've implemented them, we've built these structures. How's it going? Like, how's it going here in our community? Are we satisfied with what's happening? Is it going to be okay? Do we have some concerns about what might happen next when we bring kids back to in-person school? Those kinds of things. And then finally, we ask ourselves, what alternatives do we have when it comes to non-participation? Are there alternatives to referring to the justice system or to the child welfare system for truancy issues? And can we possibly experiment with some other approaches at the local level? So I'm going to stop there and invite you all to take up these conversations with each other and among your colleagues within your schools, with the administration, but also with students and with parents, and with other collaborative partners like your internet providers, with the agencies that you would normally refer these students to for their non-participation, thinking about what you're able to identify and what you're able to change, so that what we're really emphasizing here is that identification and belonging of young people that is meaningful and internalized for them. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you. It's my second time of being with New Hampshire educators to talk about belonging and really important issues for young people. This is where you can find me. And as you can see, this is my granddaughter, Shoshana. And she was helping me write my dissertation in this photo. And it's the kind of, identification that we would like for all of our students, right? That they really do identify with and participate with learning, having these warm feelings of belonging. And that's what I wish for you and for all of your students. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Krista. That was eye-opening for me, even as I was sitting here. I've read through the PowerPoint too, but the connection that you drew between non-identification, non-participation, and those high adversity students, it was kind of, it makes sense. Everything's clicking together. Like, oh yeah, we need to make sure we're reaching students and speaking to them as they identify.
Right, right. And we want to encourage their identification with school because, especially for kids who might be having trouble at home and who really need school as a safe haven, um, promoting that identification with school is going to be good for them. It's going to help them with a lot of the developmental deficits or adaptations they have because of their experience at home. So things like the ability to build relationships, executive function skills, which we all know are so important, being able to borrow. When kids are unable to self-regulate, they actually borrow self-regulation from the people they spend time with. So being able to borrow emotional and behavioral self-regulation from teachers is really critical for those kids.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to either type them here in the chat. We know how to reach out to Krista, or you've provided your info right there for everybody. So
Yeah.
I want to I want to encourage everybody to ask questions. We're here to help and support in this work. And I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.